Welcome boys and girls, Christine here with my Empire unit tier list for Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires campaign. So things like tier requirements, cost, upkeep, availability of units, synergy within the context of an Empire army, and usefulness against the kind of foes that the Empire is dealing with. Now, usually when you're playing an Empire campaign, you will be dealing with races like the Greenskins, races like the Vampires, races like Chaos to a degree or another. So some units that could be really good in certain situations are not necessarily going to be so useful against the vast majority of foes that you're dealing with in an Empire campaign, in a natural sense. Of course, you can always pick a fight with the High Elves, and then, of course, your army situation is going to be different. Or you can pick a fight with the Wood Elves, though I wouldn't necessarily count Dryka as regular Wood Elves, because Dryka does use a different army roster than regular Wood Elves do. Like, she'll focus a lot on Forest Spirits, less so on range capability, or regular Wood Elven melee units. So keep in mind that kind of context during the course of a campaign. So starting with the Empire Spearmen, I'm going to say that they're an F tier unit. Yes, they are available to recruit from every settlement. But here's the thing. The Empire has plenty of good units that can recruit at tier 1 from various structures. On top of that, even if you don't have a military recruitment building, there is another better unit to recruit from any single settlement. Like, these guys are just flat out not worth getting. Their melee stats are pretty pathetic. Their line holding capability can be decent against melee foes, but they're just worse because they don't have that kind of shield. I really don't see a reason to bother recruiting these guys in any campaign unless you absolutely have nothing else to recruit and you just want a bit of melee capability because you have enough range capability. But most of the time, in the situations where you just want to fill up an army, the other unit, the archers from Empire settlements, will be worth recruiting more. So there's literally no reason to ever bother with Empire Spearmen in any of the Imperial campaigns. Then we have Empire Swordsmen, also an F tier unit. Now, these guys do require barracks. And the thing about these guys, compared to the other unit that is available literally from that same barracks, they're absolutely not worth recruiting. Like, they have a shield, so they're kind of better line holders, but of course they don't have that kind of anti-large benefit as spearmen. So, just not worth recruiting. And you might think, oh, these guys are very cheap units. They are very cheap units. You know where they're not so cheap necessarily in terms of their upkeep. So, there's a bunch of Empire units that can be very cheap to recruit, especially because of all kinds of benefits that the Empire gets in terms of recruitment, but not necessarily so cheap to maintain. So keep that upkeep situation in mind. You might have this perception that Empire can maintain vast armies of very cheap units, but they're not necessarily so cheap in terms of their upkeep, and that does affect Empire strategies. Then we have Spearmen with shields, recruited from tier 1, really solid line holders all around, anti-large, shielded, will hold the line, decent leadership, not the best armor in the world, but pretty decent in auto-resolve, pretty decent on the field of battle, pretty cost-effective, all things considered. These are the units that you use to hold your flanks against fast-moving enemies. They're not a frontline unit. That's a problem the Empire has, that they don't necessarily have effective frontline units to go toe-to-toe against enemy infantry. But in terms of flank holding, in terms of protecting a side of the battlefield from various enemy attacks, these guys are really solid at their job. They will hold off a lot of the fast-moving enemy units, especially early on in a campaign. Now, of course, we can talk about Regiment's Renown, we can talk about the Electrocount State Troops. The Electrocount State Troop version of these guys are an S tier unit easily. But these ones, fairly solid A tier. You don't want to mass them, but getting like 2 to 4 in every single army is generally speaking worthwhile from a cost perspective, from a combat capability perspective. They're not going to do damage, they're not going to win the battle for you, but they are going to do their job, which is to hold the line in a decent way and also do decently with respect to auto-resolve. Then we have Halberdiers. I'm going to say Halberdiers are a D tier unit or even an F tier unit. Now, here's the weird thing. When you look at a Halberdier, in terms of its stats, you might think it's actually a decent enough unit, but they take significantly more damage for the most part than Empire Spearmen with shields. Can't necessarily explain. They do more damage, absolutely, but they're not doing enough damage to win combat engagements. They don't have the leadership of, say, Kisavai Warriors. Like Kisavai Warriors, if you put them in a 1-to-1 engagement against halberdiers, it might be a bit even. But when you're talking about a larger army, and when you're dealing with things like Chaos Warriors, when you're dealing with things like Terror, relying on these guys to hold the line against any kind of real unit is going to be a problem. They can be pretty decent against cavalry, but you already have a pretty good choice against cavalry that's also better in auto-resolve and just more cost-effective and just overall a better unit. So yeah, I don't think Empire Halberdiers are worth recruiting at all in a campaign. In fact, I'm very tempted to put them in F tier, but like F tier, they're just worthless units. These guys have some uses, but not necessarily in the campaigns area you're actually playing in an Empire campaign. Then we have Flagellants, also an F tier unit. I know there's a bunch of benefits you can get for them, but I always find unbreakable units to be of questionable value to begin with. Because when you're playing with units in a campaign, having them unbreakable is not necessarily the benefit you might think they are. Like, they're not, especially these guys, because they might be unbreakable, but they don't have the combat capability of other unbreakable units. It's one thing to talk about Slayers, and there's plenty of issues with Slayers when it comes to their unbreakable nature, but let me be clear on this. Flagellants are nothing in comparison to Slayers. There's reasons why you might want Slayers to stick in the fight, whereas with Flagellants, you absolutely have very little value with them. You can buff them up quite a bit for various benefits, to be sure, but instead of using that time and that effort and that energy and using those skills that you can spend on Flagellants, you're better off spending that kind of effort elsewhere to make just better army. They're just flat out not worth recruiting. They're not necessarily very cost effective. They're not great in combat. They're almost a worthless unit, completely worthless unit. Then we have Empire Greatswords. So these guys are a decent melee unit, but here's the problem with these guys. Like, as far as Empire infantry goes, these guys are obviously the best infantry of the Empire. But the problem is they're inferior compared to everyone else's heavy infantry. They'll lose to Chaos Warriors, or they won't necessarily trade so well against Chaos Warriors, even when you consider the cost that these guys have. They will do worse than Kislev heavy infantry, and we're talking Kislev tier 2 infantry. Don't even compare these guys to Tsar Guard. They'll flat out lose to Tsar Guard with great weapons. So they're not durable enough, they don't do enough damage. They are worth recruiting because they're the only melee, really good melee infantry you have as the Empire, but still just not really a worthwhile unit in a lot of ways. But if you're looking to fill up your melee roster with something that has greater durability and damage capability than Empire Spearmen, these are the choice to go for. But outside of that, like, kind of filler unit for an army, you want to get them, you need to get them, but yeah, just limited usage in a lot of ways. Then we have Free Company Militia. Some situational usage with regards to these guys, but not really great value, not great combat ability. They're not great in melee, they're not great in range, they're not great at skirmishing, they're flat, most of the time not worth recruiting, really. They're not completely worthless, there's just much better value units to recruit in an Empire campaign than these fellows. At least they're available fairly early on, and they're not completely worthless in combat. Like, I would rather get these than Empire Spearmen, Swordsmen, or Flagellants. Then we have Archers. Archers are going to go in B tier. I would have actually put them higher pre-Thrones of Decay, but Thrones of Decay has changed the nature of the game in terms of how Empire units are available. But Archers are a solid enough range units early on in a campaign. They're available from every settlement. They're decent enough and cheap enough as a range unit that they can get the job done. Just not a great range unit, especially considering you have other options either at the same tier or a tier higher. Just one tier higher. And we're talking here about gunpowder options or crossbow options available in a campaign. Then we have Empire crossbowmen. I think I'm going to put Empire crossbowmen in B tier as well. They're good. They're solid enough range units. They're just an upgrade to the archer, like just more armor piercing, more combat capability, just better stats all around. They do get the job done, but there's also much better ranged options in an Empire campaign. You would get these dependent on the kind of terrain you're dealing with in a campaign, so they are worth using in a decent amount of situations, but more often than not, in most Imperial campaigns, there's just more incentive to recruit other units than these guys. Then we have Huntsmen. Huntsmen are an A tier unit, really solid bow unit, have maneuverability, firing while moving, have a bit of stealth on the battlefield. These guys can do a good job. They're good against monstrous units. They're good against pretty much anything, really. These guys form the backbone of an Empire range line before the release of Thrones of Decay. But in fact, before Thrones of Decay, I would have put them as an S tier unit, but now they're an A tier unit because, well, we got some crazy options with Thrones of Decay. Then we have handgunners. I would say handgunners, they're available at tier 2. They do get the job done. They do a decent amount of damage. They're just decent. I don't think they're an S or A tier unit, but they're obviously not a horrible unit either. So they get the job done in a campaign. They do have that kind of decent range capability. They would be higher if not for the inherent weaknesses that gunpowder units do have. Then we have Nuln Ironsides. Nuln Ironsides and Hochland long rifles are S tier units, both of them. Really strong gunpowder units in Warhammer 3, some of the best gunpowder units in the game. Like Hochland, like Nuln Ironsides are just a better handgunner in every single way that matters, whereas Nuln Ironsides, whereas Hochland long rifles are a really good long-range sniper available for the Empire. They're not going to be useful in every single situation of a campaign, but for the most part, you will want to recruit these guys. There's very few situations where these guys are not useful. You may not want to mass them completely in an army, but just like Jezzails are useful for the Skaven, so are these guys useful for the Empire. And yeah, Nuln Ironside is really, really good gunpowder unit. In fact, one of the best gunpowder unit in the game that doesn't have that kind of sniper role like Jezzails or Hochland long rifles have. War Wagons, F tier unit, easily pathetic unit, not worth bothering with. Like, it's a skirmishing chariot, but they don't do a great deal of damage. You might benefit from the elevated platform that these guys have on offer, but yeah, just not really worth bothering with all that much. War Wagons with mortars, now that's a different discussion, because they have maneuverability, they have a good deal of damage. Their projectiles, like, the only reason they're not S tier is the AI has a tendency of dodging mortar projectiles, but really, as far as a unit goes, like, really solid unit that gets the job done, does a fairly solid job on the battlefield. The one reason I would put them in S tier is because of their tier requirement, so that is a bit annoying, but in terms of combat capability, certainly War Wagons with mortars are always worth considering one way or another. Then we have a landship. I know this might piss off some people, but I think a landship is a B tier unit. It's a large single entity. It's not necessarily so great in damage. It can help you deal with trouble spots, so if one of your flanks is going to be broken by enemy forces, you can send a landship there and it will do a decent enough job. So it can be, you can use it for troubleshooting. You can fix problems in a situation, but yeah, I do find it a bit lacking as a unit compared to some of the other options. And that other option would be the Steam Tank. So the Steam Tank, the regular Steam Tank, is an A tier unit. Decent amount of maneuverability, huge amount of durability. Like, you can throw Steam Tanks into the middle of an enemy army, and because of the Empire playstyle, be it gunpowder units, artillery, all that, you can pin a significant portion of the enemy army, even if it's a really powerful army. You can pin them, even get out because of the huge mass that these guys have. and use your artillery and ranged units to decimate the enemy in the meantime. These guys are your real tanks. And then we have the volley gun unit version of the steam tank. This is just flat out the better version. The weapons on the regular steam tanks do leave a lot to be desired, but the volley gun, just an amazing amount of capability there. So it's the same kind of benefits of the regular steam tank, like that kind of maneuverability in a battlefield. Like, it's not about the speed, it's about like mass. It's about rolling this thing in the middle of an enemy army and making sure it gets out. A steam tank will do that. A land ship, it won't necessarily get stuck, but it will take a lot more damage. A steam tank with a volley gun, well, let's just say it might kill everything inside or a good portion of the enemy army as well. So I do think that steam tanks with volley guns are absolutely an S tier unit. Almost always worth recruiting. The one downside is that they are a tier 5 unit, but in terms of value proposition, they're just a really great unit to have. They mesh very well with the Empire playstyle. They keep enemy forces pinned while also doing a decent amount of damage. Then we have mortars. Fairly easy to recruit, so that's the reason I'm not going to put them lower. If they hit units in a siege, like these guys can do well in sieges, they won't take down walls, but they'll take down units on the walls, they'll take down units behind the walls. They can deal with any kind of terrain, which is a benefit as an artillery unit. The one downside is if you're playing on higher battle difficulties, the AI does have that tendency of avoiding a lot of that damage these guys do. So that is absolutely a downside when we're talking about cannons for the Empire, great cannons for the Empire, like absolutely an A tier unit. Obviously, on battlefields, they're not necessarily going to be the best artillery unit you have, but you do have a lot of sieges to deal with. And these things are amazing in sieges. They will do a lot of damage to walls, they'll do a lot of damage to towers, barricades, anything the AI can build in a siege, these guys will deal with that very effectively. So I do think cannons are always worth recruiting in an Empire campaign. Just not the same kind of battlefield capability as some other units. Then we have Hellblaster volley guns. I'm also going to put this in a C tier. I do think they're a decent unit, but when I'm thinking about artillery, right? So they're short range, they can do a decent amount of damage. Fair enough. But if I'm looking for short range damage, I have, null iron sights, for instance, as a choice. In an Empire campaign, or I can get the Hellblaster volley gun. There's just better choices for short range damage. For long range damage, yeah, they're lacking in that respect. They're not horrible. They do what they're meant to, but they're just not necessarily worth getting a lot of times. Hellstorm rocket battery is obviously an S tier. It's situational sometimes. It may depend on the field of battle, but when these things hit, they do a truckload of damage. These are the units that can carry you through battles that you flat out should not win. Like, as I said, one of the strategies to use in an Empire is to use something like a tank. And maybe even a land ship if you don't have a siege tank. But you can get Electrocon State Troopers for a siege tank. And then use something like a Hellstorm rocket battery to just pulverize the massed enemy formation that are trying to target your tanks or maybe your lords or heroes. You actually have a good amount of durability on your heroes, like Archlectors or Warrior Priests actually have more durability in my thinking. You can let the enemy target, try and surround them, target them, and then just blow them up with Hellstorm rocket batteries. Just works. Luminarchs S tier unit, like It's crazy. This used to be one of the worst units in the entire Empire roster. But Creative Assembly has fixed its accuracy. It hits like a truck. You bring a Luminarch against a Legendary Lord or a big single entity, it might just kill them on its own. It is freaking crazy how much damage these things do. And since their accuracy has been improved, they are absolutely worth recruiting at the moment. Sure, you gotta consider the tier requirement, but it's hard to argue against the kind of benefits that you get from an Luminarch of Hysh. Just a really strong unit. Then we have Pistoliers and Outriders. I think both Pistoliers and Outriders are A tier units. I wouldn't quite put them S tier because they do have limitations because they're old. They're not going to be so great in sieges. But these guys are amazing in open field battles. Like, they can run around in circles around an enemy and just do devastating damage without being caught. There's pros and cons with Pistoliers versus Outriders. Like, Outriders don't necessarily do the same kind of damage, or more like damage over time from my experience. Pistoliers do more direct damage. Both of them are units that, you know, can do a lot of damage while on the move, and just harass the crap out of the enemy, and you can abuse the AI. Like, you might have an army with infantry and artillery in a corner, and then just a couple of pistolers and outriders can harass like half the entire enemy army and do devastating damage. Outriders with grenade launchers, well, the damage they do is pretty good, undeniably so, but it's short range damage. If you can get these guys into the position where, say, a portion of the army is engaged in melee with someone, with an infantry line, and you can get these guys on the flank to do a bunch of grenade damage, they can devastate significant portions of the enemy army. However, they just don't have the flexibility as pistoliers and outriders, so I'm going to put them in C tier from my perspective. Not even B tier. Like, I do generally recruit outriders and pistoliers. Pistoliers especially because they're very easy to recruit. Outriders do require a higher tier. But yeah, outriders and grenade launchers, not necessarily that useful of a unit from my perspective. They do great damage, but they also have those kind of limitations during the course of a battle. So keep in mind. They're also very vulnerable. Like, they're a glass cannon type unit when we're talking about that. Then we have Empire Knights. They're not bad. They're actually a pretty decent cavalry unit, all things considered. But here's the thing. The Empire, at the tier you get them, you can also get Outriders. And these require their own structure. So when you're building when you're starting an Empire campaign, at tier 2, would you rather get Empire Knights, or would you rather get a Warrior Priest hero, or a Mage hero, or a Witch Hunter with... so you can get an Engineer, you can get a Witch Hunter, and Outriders and Pistoliers, you can get an Imperial Captain, if you want to, or you can get these guys. I think I would rather take everything else than get these guys. That's not to say Empire Cavalry is useless, far from it. But one of the things to mention about that's actually going against these guys is there's much better cavalry choices at a tier higher than these guys that will vastly outperform them in every single way. Then we have the Knights of the Black Rose of the Empire. Well, I think they're a B tier unit. They're not horrible. They're good cavalry in the sense that you can throw them into the middle of a melee and they'll actually do a pretty decent job at holding the line, but they do lack that kind of shock cavalry capability. Not a horrible unit, far from it. Worth recruiting in certain situations, but other cavalry units of the Empire may be worth recruiting more. Then we have Knights of the Blazing Sun. I think Knights of the Blazing Sun, a lot of people may underestimate them, but these guys are really good shock cavalry for the tier that they're available on. Yes, they may take a bit longer to recruit, but given the fact that you're not recruiting cavalry en masse, that's not necessarily as big of a problem. And in terms of their combat capability, their charge bonus, their benefits against undead, I generally find that using Knights of the Blazing Sun to be a very worthwhile investment. It used to be a problem because you basically required the high tier Talabime to really make full use of them or not have them expensive as a truck of gold, but nowadays they're far more reasonable in terms of their cost, and they're pretty good units, all things considered. Then we have Reiksguard. There's pros and cons between Reiksguard and Knights of the Blazing Sun. You can use both of them. Like, I would say, like, Reiksguard are maybe just better in a stand-up fight. Knights of the Blazing Sun better at charging. Both of them are fairly useful. I'd say Reiksguard are better with Karl Franz for clear and obvious reasons. But yeah, both units do get the job done. Both units are very solid in their own right. So really no complaints. Then we have the Demigryphs. I think regular Demigryphs are an S tier unit. Like regular Demigryphs with lances. Like these are the ultimate charge cavalry of the Empire. You do have the version with halberds, but I do find the version with halberds to be somewhat less useful. Like, these guys are really good at shock cavalry. They're good against other cavalry. These guys are better in terms of armor piercing. So I would say, like, the halberd version is better in a stand-up fight. And given the fact that these are monstrous cavalry units, they're not horrible. But with the Empire, I do want that shock cavalry capability that Demigryphs with lances do provide, and I think they're really worthwhile. That's, by the way, one of the problems with the Empire Cavalry chain. Like, you look at Empire Knights, well, okay, I can recruit Empire Knights, but a tier higher I get, Reiksguard, Knights of the Blazing Sun, Knights of the Black Rose. And then a tier higher I get Demigriff. So what's the value proposition in Empire Knights? That's just my perspective on that subject. So that's where I stand with regards to the generic Empire unit tier list. With regards to Electrocon State Troopers and where regiments are now, it's similar, of course, though you could consider certain things higher, like Karabor Greatswords are obviously, a tier higher, if you consider that. The various handgunner regiments renowned and Electrocon State Troopers obviously just fly out better, all that kind of stuff. And the Electrocon State Troop version of the Empire Spearmen is like one of the best freaking units, because like they have all the benefits of the Spearmen with shields, but they're also far, far more durable. So those are the ultimate line holders in an Empire campaign. That's all I had to say. Costin signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.